Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Jonathan Bobaljik. He's a professor of linguistics at Harvard University. He specializes in morphology, syntax, and typology. And today we're talking mostly about morphology, morphosyntax, human universals in language, and other related topics. So, Dr. Bobaljik, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to everyone.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So I've already had a few interviews on linguistics on the show, but actually I've never spoken before about morphology specifically, at least as far as I remember. So could you tell us a little bit to start off with what morphology is? I mean, as someone who is interested in morphology in linguistics, what kinds of questions are you interested in, and what kinds of questions do people who work on this specific topic try to answer?
Great. Yes, that's a great question. It's actually sort of one of the smaller disciplines within linguistics, so it's not surprising that you haven't heard much about it. So morphology is the study of words. Morph means form. It's the form of words. And the kinds of questions we look at correspondences between form and meaning beyond the arbitrary. So famously, 100 years ago, more than that now, Ferdinand de Saussure pointed out that the reason the word dog means dog is sort of arbitrary. It's just a bunch of sounds and they mean what they mean. But beyond that, the word dogs just doesn't happen to mean a number of dogs. It means a number of dogs because it's got dog in it and another piece z, and that other piece means plural or indicates plural. So we like to look at cross-linguistically at these complex words that have multiple pieces inside them, and we ask, what are are there any limits, any possible rules on the combination of those words, or the combination of the pieces to create words? So you get some neat puzzles like ambiguity. The word unlockable is a fun and interesting word in English, because it means almost its own opposite. On the one hand, it means something that is able to be unlocked. On the other hand, it means something that cannot be locked. It is unlockable, a door that has no binding to connect it, or et cetera. And so we have a theory cross-linguistically of we try to develop a theory of how these relationships between form and meaning are constrained in languages. And like you said in the introduction, whether there are any universals to this is an open question.
And what are these building blocks of words? I mean, what are the units that we're dealing with here exactly?
So the easiest way to think about this, and the way we like to think about it the most, the sort of most constrained view, is what we call morphemes. It's morphology. We study morphemes. Phonology studies phonemes, etc. So the pieces, the un in unlockable, the able in unlockable, the z in dogs, we call these morphemes. These are minimal pairings of form and meaning. And I say form rather than sound. We've discovered over the last decades, that sign languages have analogous structures, have very much the same structures as spoken languages. So you'll see classical definitions that say pairings of sound and meaning, but it's really pairings of form and meaning. These languages have exactly the kind of rich structure that we see. There is, I should say, right, morphology is based on the study of morphemes, but it's not always easy to break things down into pieces. So the past tense of run in English is ran. It's not like, or the plural of man is men. It's not like dogs. You don't say mans. So it's less clear that there's little pieces or morphemes in these things, but it's the same general kinds of ideas.
So when it comes to morphemes and basically how you break down words into smaller components, is that something that you as a linguist, for example, just do because it's useful, scientifically speaking, to understanding how language works? Or does it have a correspondent in terms of how we cognitively process language? I mean, do those smaller components correspond to something cognitively speaking?
But absolutely, we believe that this is cognitively instantiated. This is a key piece of it. So the kinds of evidence that we take for looking cross-linguistically We analyze individual languages as static systems. We say, what are the pieces of it? But we also ask how children acquire these things, when they acquire these things. A famous example that you may have come across elsewhere is what's called the WUG test. This was Jean Berko-Gleason in the 1950s. Did a test with children to show, these were 3- and 4-year-old children. You draw a little figure that they've never seen before, some imaginary animal. You say, this is a wug. And then you have 2 of them and you say, what are these? And kids say these are wugs. They know that this is the right way of doing it. Interestingly, in English, we have this distinction between z and s. So dogs and cats. You don't say cat z and you don't say dogs s. You could, in principle. There's nothing about the articulatory system that constrains this. And we can see this with what's called minimal pairs. I'm in Boston right now. There's the famous baseball stadium, Fenway Park. This is in a fen. A fen is a kind of swamp. And when there's more than one, we say the fens with z, because that's the plural rule. But we can say the word fence. There's nothing wrong with having a s after an n. It's totally reasonable. You can put an s after an n, but you don't. And kids know this when they are 3 and 4 years old without ever being taught. This is the advantage of the WUG test. So we know that there must be some developing cognitive system that manipulates these rules that to some extent children have long before they have a conscious introduction or instruction about language. And so ultimately, this test was done in the 1950s. People are now working on neuroimaging tests and much fancier tests, but we know it is cognitively instantiated. Exactly how is a much harder question, and that goes beyond.
No, I understand that. But let me just ask you another question about that then. I mean, in that case, basically children, infants learning without direct instruction, are you referring to how they learn the rules of the language they are being exposed to? Or are we talking about a broader cognitive system that operates potentially across all languages or across different languages?
That's a beautiful question. That's a beautiful question. Both. The answer is both. They're learning the rules, as you say. In this case, the rule is a rule of adding. The rule has 2 components. One is adding S or Z, and one is choosing between S or Z. The choice between S or Z is a phonological rule. It has to do with the way sounds combine. And as I said, it's a non-obvious rule. If you think about it, we can say the S after an N, but we don't in the plural. So there's something very special and English specific about it that children need to learn. So this is a rule, but it's also a piece. The S plural is a piece. It's one of these morphemes. So we are interested in how children acquire the language that they are exposed to, as you frame it, long before parents aren't saying, this is how you say the plural, this is how you say the plural. And also children have to figure out why you don't say mans. They sometimes make errors and say things like this, or foots, right? Why you say feet. So they have to learn the pieces, they have to learn the rules, and all of these things involve, so the specific pieces and the specific rules are specific to the language that they're learning. And this is a really interesting area of study. How do they do this? How do they do this so quickly? There is a sparsity of data. There's a limited amount of time in the day. There's a limited number of words that kids hear. There's an infinite number of possible rule systems that they could be acquiring that would be compatible, that would describe accurately the language they're exposed to, but they tend very quickly to hone in on the same one, and they get there very fast. And that's neat. That's a very interesting idea. And that then asks this question you said earlier about the broader cognitive system of all of language. So it seems to be that they are not just what we used to consider a blank slate. This was a proposal from a long time ago, that the child's mind is a blank slate upon which the experience writes. It seems to be constrained in various ways. There are patterns. First of all, children learn very quickly and converge on some hypotheses and not others. And secondly, cross-linguistically, this comes back to what we were saying, cross-linguistically, certain patterns occur in many languages and other patterns don't occur in any languages that we know of. And that suggests, it's another type of evidence, that suggests that there's some kind of cognitive limitation on the hypotheses, if you will, that learners will posit when they're analyzing the language data. And we're trying to capture that. We're trying to figure that out, kind of reverse engineer the system from the data that we have.
Mhm. So we'll get more into human universals in language and more specifically morphology later on in our conversation. There are some other very interesting questions to explore here. But just before that, I think that you've already touched a little bit on this question in your previous answers. But what can we learn about language by studying morphology then?
We can learn a lot. I hope we can learn a lot because this is what I do, right? So one thing we can try to figure out, again, by looking at what patterns occur and what patterns don't occur, we can begin to build an idea of how the human cognitive system works. Ultimately, that's the goal, is to get to the cognitive system, but it's a distant goal. It's on the horizon. Right now, we're at the level of looking for these patterns cross-linguistically. If I could, for example, switch to one of the universal patterns at the moment now, and we'll come back. I know you want to talk about these in more detail later, but I think this gives you a good way of answering this question. Work I did a number of years ago looked at comparatives and superlatives. So you say good and you say better, and in a language where you say big, bigger, biggest, right? Portuguese, you do these paraphrastically, I think, right? You say the analog of big, more big, and the more big.
Yes.
Right. But the interesting thing is for the irregular ones, like good, better, best, you never find a language that says good, the equivalent of better with a totally different form, and then goes back and says goodest. You don't say good, better, goodest. Why not? Well, this turns out to be like sort of an interesting finding across lots and lots and lots of languages. I believe it's a universal. I know of no counterexamples. And if that's true, what does that tell us? Okay, we've documented the languages, we've made a list, and we have this neat fact. But the explanation that seems to be on the table is one that goes along the lines of saying, what does best mean? And there's sort of two things best could mean. One could mean just exceedingly good, like very, very, very good. This would be these issimo type adjectives that you have in Romance that we lack in English, something like bellissimo or whatever. But another one is the more specific one. And the more specific one, the meaning of the superlative is more adjective than all others, right? So if I say something is the tallest mountain, right, it is taller than all other mountains. And that taller piece is comparative inside it. It has this comparative meaning inside it. In English, taller and tallest don't look like they have the morphology inside them. In Portuguese, they do, because you put the definite article in front. But it looks, the only way to understand why this is a universal is if all languages really are Portuguese, but hidden. So English tallest really is the more tall, the one that is taller than all of the others. If that's true, we learn this from morphology, from looking at the various pieces in the words. But what we've discovered is a constraint on the way we as humans conceptualize, at least for the language system, the meaning of the superlative relationship. So you wouldn't get that from a textbook. If you look at a textbook of English or German or whatever, it just says, here's the comparative, here's the superlative. But it turns out this is the way we conceive of it. Why? There's all different ways we could have conceived of it. There's all different ways the world could have been, but it is this way. And so you asked, this is a long-winded answer, but you asked about what studying morphology tells us. And here it's telling us something about the cognitive conception of, in this case, the meaning of the superlative, but all kinds of aspects of how concepts are encoded in language seem to follow these kinds of universal generalizations. And that's exciting because it's non-obvious and it comes from the linguistic system. I can give you a second example quickly if you want. But
yes, please go ahead. Yes.
Okay. So another neat example that comes from morphology. This one's a little bit complicated, but again, it's a meaning one. If you think about words like open or close, they can be adjectives or they can be verbs. And so if we say, I'm in New England and New England has snowy weather in the winter. So imagine we think about a mountain pass. and you say that the mountain pass, let's imagine there's a shoulder of a mountain. It has no dip inside it. And what happens at some point is there's a rock fall or an avalanche, and a dip appears. This dip has never been there before, and now we have a pass. We say a pass has opened up, right? Then there's another rock fall, and it fills it in. We can say, oh, the pass is closed again. Right? Well, that's interesting. The again here is really interesting because it has never been closed before. Nobody had closed it before. It opened once and then went closed again. So what this again is doing is it's saying it's returning to the state of being closed. The verb, the action, close the pass, has never happened before. But it's a return, we call it a restitutive reading. It is returned to the state. And you can think of all kinds of examples. A student at McGill wrote a dissertation looking at this. You can think of an underwater cave that's full of water. And then the water level goes down and it dries out. And then global warming, the water level rises again, and the cave is filled in again, right? We can use this again, even though it's false to say that we filled in, like the action of filling in has happened for a second time. It only happened once, but it returns it to its previous state. So you might think, so there's an analysis out there that says, okay, this is because the semantics of the word again, what again means, is ambiguous in English. It can mean either of these two things. But it turns out it means the same ambiguity, the same two things in language after language after language. A student at University of Connecticut wrote a dissertation showing this for Chinese, for Mandarin, that it shows exactly the same ambiguity. So why is this morphology? Well, in a number of languages, the way you say to open or to close has an extra morpheme. It's like in English, we say the screen is wide. Actually, let's say the screen is narrow. I want to widen it. There's a wide piece and a morpheme N. And so the again can refer just to the adjective or to the adjective plus the verbal morpheme, the complex verb. That ambiguity is a morphological ambiguity. It's hidden in English because when we say open, it looks like it's the same word, but it really isn't. There's really two pieces in there, and we can pick them up semantically. And we can do this in language after language after language. So again, we've learned something about the way languages encode our perception of events in the world. So we encode a notion like opening as having two pieces. There's a causal piece and there's a state piece. And the linguistic system can pick out those pieces individually. It's a bit of a complex example, but these are the kinds of things that we study over and over and over. Again, as you framed it, there's a fun day-to-day part, which is finding the pieces and segmenting it into, but that's just the starting part. At the end behind it, we're asking these deeper questions about why do we find the same patterns in language after language, and what does that tell us about human cognition, both the system of language and the system of encoding meaning in language.
Mm-hmm. And what is morphosyntax?
Ah, cool. Good question. Morphosyntax has two pieces in it, right? It has morpho and it has syntax. It's a complex word. It has morphemes. And so morpho is the morphology part, and syntax is how words combine together to make phrases. And so one of the things we ask as morphologists, we pay an eye to. So when I looked at dog and dogs, I was looking primarily, the example I gave you was about the sound, the s alternation. But there's also a study of how individual words relate to syntax, to the study of phrases and the study of sentences. So just to take an example, your dogs example, that's a plural word, and so it would occur in a plural syntactic environment. You would say one dog, two dogs. Interesting on this, one of the things you could look at in morphosyntax, some languages like English, Portuguese, and others have a number distinction. We have singular and plural. There's other languages with other number distinctions. That's also very interesting. And we use the plural when we count, we say two dogs. And we use the plural when we talk about a plural group. We say, oh, dogs are in the garden or something of this sort. There are languages that have no number distinction, that never mark this. And there are, interestingly, languages that mark plural, dogs, when you say, I like dogs, or I saw dogs yesterday, but not when you put a number there. You say two dog. Turkish is of this sort. You say, they have a plural, there's a clear plural marker, but when you use it with a number, evidently the number conveys enough information The plural in English is somehow redundant in that fact. If you say two, you already said two, but we have to say dogs. You can't say two dogs. So morphosyntax studies, so where morphology proper studies the internal form of words and maybe their connection to sound and meaning, morphosyntax studies the syntactic contexts in which words do and don't occur. And again, we ask the same kinds of questions about universals and recurring patterns and how children acquire those patterns and what they tell us about the cognitive apparatus.
But what is then the relationship, or how should we look at the relationship between morphology and syntax? Is it that one drives the other, or is it that both influence each other in different ways?
Yeah, this is something, if you get a bunch of morphologists together at a conference, we will fight. So let's go back to unlockable, or even just take lockable, right? Or teacher and teachable and teach and stuff. Teach is a verb, so it occurs in a particular place in the syntax in a language like English. It has a particular set of properties. A teacher is a noun, so I can't teacher you and I can't teachable you. Teachable as an adjective, so it's going to have a different syntax. And it seems reasonable from this kind of example to take the phrase you used, that morphology drives syntax, that you build the words. You have the word teach, it's a verb, and so it has a particular syntax. Or you make the word teacher, it's a noun, and so because you have added the suffix "er," it has a different syntax, a nominal syntax. You say the teacher is whatever, tall, short, boring, interesting, something. And so this makes you think, okay, that the morphology is prior. First, you put the pieces together, and then what you've done in the morphology drives or determines your syntax. But there's other examples that work differently that seem to suggest the other direction. And this is why this is a live question. Let's see if I can give you an example in quick form. So in English, we have in inflectional morphology, we're relatively poor. In some languages, when you take the verb shows what the person and number of the subject are. In English, you get that a bit with be, I am, you are, she is, etc. But with regular verbs in the present tense, we only have a two-way distinction. He, she, it works, and everything else is work. I work, you work, they work, etc. There's no ending on these things. And it actually turns out to be hard you could sort of say that works is driving the syntax. Works is third person singular. It takes a third person singular subject because it has the S on it. But the other one doesn't have any information on it. So you could say, okay, it just doesn't contribute any information, and that's why you have a pronoun. I work, you work, they work. Like the Turkish to dog. You don't need to have an ending on it because the ending is redundant. But if that's the case, you should be able to say he work, she work, or it work. These would be fine. They're equally informative as I work, they work, you work, etc. There's no reason that should be the case. So here you want to say that the syntax is driving the morphology, that you've chosen your subject first. You say, I want to talk about myself. I say I, and then I choose the best fitting form of the verb for that context. And English has a poor range of choices. Portuguese has more, Inuktitut has more, lots of languages have more. English is very poor. I've got two choices, S or nothing. And S is the best choice for a third person singular. And if I'm not third person singular, I don't choose S. So the information seems to work the other way. First, you determine the syntactic context, and then you choose the form that best fits that context. And so we have evidence here that's pulling us in two different directions as to whether morphology drives syntax. And a lot of the work that's done today is to ask, can we go back to the evidence that looks like it goes one way and rethink it, reanalyze it, so that everything really goes in one direction, a simpler theory maybe. I think that's true. I think we can get a lot of work done by saying that morphology never drives syntax, that it always works the way works, that it's always the way that you determine the syntax first, somewhat abstractly, and then you determine the morphological form relative to that syntax. But it's a harder, more abstract argument to make.
But in this particular case, really understanding and coming to a conclusion when it comes to this debate as to whether morphology drives syntax or the other way around. Would these have broader implications as to how we understand the cognition behind language? I mean, would these basically have ramifications to other aspects of how we process language, or is it restricted to the question itself regarding morphology and
So
syntax?
it would, but every time we go up a level, and I'm sure this is true with other people you talk to in other fields, every time you go up a level of abstraction, the questions become more abstract and it's harder to make a compelling argument one way or another. But the works case, the works versus work case, this is an example of, we describe it, it's described in many, many terms by different people, but it's competition. You think about language as I said, choosing the best form, here's our superlative again, choosing the best form for the particular syntactic context. And there's a view out there that this is a fundamental property of language, that all of it involves some notion of competition. This is clear in what's called pragmatics. It's clear in other kinds of realms. Let me come back to another example. One of the things with number cross-linguistically, as I said, English has singular and plural. Some languages also have a dual, which marks exactly two. So there'd be three forms of the word dog. Inuktitut works this way. We talk about the Inuit language, the Inuit people. The Inuit is the plural, Inuk is the singular. And then there's another form, Inuk, which is when there's exactly two. When we ask about these languages, these are the major possibilities in the world's languages. Either you have a singular plural distinction or you have singular, plural, and dual. The interesting thing is that in some cases, the dual is restricted. You only have the dual at certain times. The plural, when the plural is contrasted with a dual, means three or more. If I have a dual form available and I use the plural form, Inuit, I mean, for example, three or more and not two. So the plural there seems to mean something different than it does in English or Portuguese. But if I have if I don't have the dual form available, then the plural just means more than one, the sort of normal meaning of plural. So again, we think about this as a term, as a sense of competition. I've gone back into morphology, but we think about this in terms of competition. You look at the best form, the most informative form that's available for the particular environment that you're looking at. And so it has to be a competition among competing forms. There's a theory that this is how language works broad, not just morphology, but generally when we say a sentence, we use where there's competing kinds of constraints. I'm trying to be lazy as a speaker and say the shortest thing, but I'm also trying to be as informative as possible to you. And I'm balancing these domains. And so this kind of competition might deeply characterize all of language, the cognitive system that involves language. And so when we look at morphology, we're looking at a piece of this system and asking, in particular on the technical aspect, do the kinds of the kinds of assumptions we need to make about characterizing the cognitive system to understand the morphology match up with the kinds of ways people deal with competition in pragmatics or in syntax and semantics, etc. And this is an exciting area. I mean, I wish I could tell you, yes, the answer is yes, and we know this. But then I could just hang up my hat and say we've finished the field. There's a lot of open questions. I think there's exciting reasons to think this is true, but not everybody sees it that way, and so there's work still to be done.
No, this is I guess, the beauty of science. It's an ongoing enterprise, and it's also fascinating to notice over time how knowledge changes and evolves. So, but let's get then into human universals, specifically in language. So, what do you make of universal grammar and the work by Noam Chomsky? Earlier, you suggested that you're not very much into blank slatist approaches to, I guess, human cognition more broadly, but to language more specifically, but specifically about Noam Chomsky's work, because if I understand it correctly, even what universal grammar entails for he himself, it has changed over time slightly, right?
So there's a lot of discussion of this, peripheral discussion, and I think there's a lot of confusion about the terminology, or different people that are talking at somewhat cross purposes because they're using the terminology in different ways. Um, the initial proposal, and I think the part that has remained unchanged in this, and I think that the part it should almost be uncontroversial, is this sort of polar opposition between the blank slate and not the blank slate. So put a pin in the notion of universal grammar just for a moment. What we say is, why is it that children learn languages quickly? They learn a lot of properties without explicit instruction, and they converge on the same answers or the same structures or the same patterns in language after language after language, sometimes universal to the extent that we know. And Chomsky's answer was, if they are just reacting to the environment, this was the behaviorist idea, as a blank slate, this would be a surprising fact, a surprising outcome. And he suggested that there are universal cognitive constraints, inherent biases that shape the way children are going to interact with the data in the world around them. We know such biases exist independently. I'm sure you've talked to people in other fields. The easy one to appreciate is that newborn babies fixate on two circles and a line. If you put that pattern on the wall, the day they're born, they look at that. So they're somehow pre-programmed to look for faces. It's probably not the case that they are looking for faces, but there's some inherent hardwired bias that affects their visual and attention system, that chooses the way the massive amount of data that's coming towards them is filtered. And Chomsky's proposal was that there are such filters for language, and this is universal grammar. Universal grammar is not that we all share the same rule for making plurals, or we all share like you pick up a grammar book and it says, you write the subject before the verb. None of that is universal. The universal grammar refers to these filters or these biases. And at that level, that seems to be right. That just seems to be right. The debates now, and this is where you might say that Chomsky's thinking about this over time has changed, is what is the content of those biases? What are the form? And there's two ways of thinking about this, and you may have heard these terms before. One is it domain specific or domain general? So are our biases specific to language? Are the pieces that are hardwired, the constraints that make us approach the data in a particular way, are those specific to language, or are they general cognitive properties? So I gave you an argument. My view would say that universal grammar, our inherent cognitive capacities, tells us that the only way to make a true superlative is one that contains the comparative. You can only build the meaning more X than all others if you can build the meaning more X. So if our brains manipulate, or our minds manipulate symbolic representations, this is a constraint on possible symbolic representations. That's cool, right? And so I would see that as a part of universal grammar. We're constrained to approach the data that way, and that's consistent with sort of Chomsky's view. But what I don't know is whether the source of that constraint is about linguistic symbolic representations or about symbolic representations in the brain generally, including non-linguistic representations. And that's a hard thing to do, to try to figure out, right? The counting universal as well, right? So I said there are three possibilities. Languages have no marking of number. You have marking of singular plural distinctions on nouns, like in English, after a number, or just in general when you're talking about plurals. Or you do it when you're just talking about plurals, but Turkish-like, not after the noun. It's not just about redundancy. If it was just about redundancy, English would be just like Turkish. To dog would be totally fine. And so we ask about the nature of the symbolic system. And so then you want to ask, how fine-grained is universal grammar in this system? How fine-grained are the predetermined constraints on the cognitive system that yield these patterns as the output? What are the contributions that come from outside of language, general psychology, general cognition? And what are the constraints that come from a language system? And certainly over time, Chomsky's view and other people's view on both the content, what is language specific and what is more domain general, and what is the form of the specific restrictions has changed. Early work had a lot richer universal grammar in terms of its content of the actual specific formulation, and the thinking has changed that it's actually, it may have less that is specific to language, but that comes from general systems and has specific instantiations in language. And this is what I spend my day looking at, and I don't see evidence against, at the broad level, the view that there are hardwired constraints that surface in the way children learn and in the way we see these patterns cross-linguistically as universals. I'm happy to fight with people about the narrow details, but at the broad level, that seems to be right.
Okay, but at this point, then, if I were to ask you, what do we know about human universals in language? What can we say about that? I mean, what are the universals that we can point to?
Yeah, so there's actually there's quite a few, and there's quite a few at the level of description. I can give you a whole bunch. Most of them are, and so this is actually another interesting point of terminology. There's many different kinds of universals, and people use this in different ways. In morphology, most people using the term universal mean it in what we call an implicational universal. It does not mean that all languages have some particular property, but rather statements of the form, if a language has this property, then it has that property. So for example, if a language has a dual number form, a form that marks two elements, like dog, dogs, we don't in English, we only have singular, plural. If a language marks a distinction between dual and non-dual, it also marks a distinction between plural and non-plural, 3 and above. And that was first observed 50, 60, 70 years ago. And of course, scientists are an ornery bunch. Anytime someone proposes a universal, a whole bunch of young, energetic people try to show that it's wrong. And they point to various examples and we look at them more closely. And it isn't wrong. It's right. It's true, right? So there is somebody, Franz Planck in Germany, who keeps an archive of proposed universals with notes on their various kinds of alleged counterexamples, etc. There are a lot in morphology. There are a lot of these kinds of universals, implicational universals. There are things we know. There are a lot more proposed universals, some of which are proposed over smaller samples, and we don't know yet whether they're right. But there are a lot of universals of this sort. And I could give you lists. I've alluded to a few others already, with like the no, good, better, goodest type universal. Pronominal systems of I, me, you, he, she, it, then. There are really, at a fundamental level, in terms of person marking, first person, second person, etc., there are really fundamentally only two systems that languages have. There are only two, and everything else is a variation on one of those two systems. And the two systems are the English style or Portuguese or European style system, where you have first person, second person, and third person. I am, you are, she is, right? And then there are languages that have that, plus in addition, for the first person plural, we, they make a distinction that we call an inclusive versus an exclusive we. So when I say we find this interesting, I'm actually ambiguous about whether I'm including you, right? I could mean me and the other linguists, or I could mean you and me because we're talking about it. There are languages where you have to specify, where you have to actually just make that distinction. But again, if our persons are first person, me, second person, you, and third person, the inclusive is built by combining the first and the second person semantically. It takes the same pieces and it combines them. There are sociologists, Irving Goffman was one such sociologist, who work on personal interaction. And so we talk in linguistics, when I say you, right? I mean you. Oh, what's the you? What's the second person? And we can describe it as the addressee, the one I'm talking to, or the hearer, or the interlocutor, the various ways. He notes that there's a lot of different usages of language where these concepts break apart. So in theater, we can talk about a stage whisper. I look at some other actor on stage, but I say something which is clearly for the benefit of the audience, or vice versa. You can think of all these kinds of things. But languages never make these distinctions. There's no special forms for any of this. So again, we have universals of language. They're telling us something about the cognitive system, and there's lots and lots and lots of these. But we still don't quite know to what extent the understanding of these universals arises independent of language and is reflected in language. So, in the universals of person, there's a bunch of interesting ones about how first person works. This may be because of what we call a theory of mind, something children learn early on in their experience. They don't have at birth, but they get later, is a sense of self. They recognize that they exist and are distinct from the rest of the world. I recognize I exist, the ego, the self, the whatever, right? And language then reflects that and prioritizes expression of the first person, right, in interesting ways morphologically. So these universals are out there, but if you're looking for universals of the form, all languages do this, or no languages do that, those are rarer and fewer and farther between. But like for first person, second person, third person, all languages have some way in which first person and second person play a role in their systems. And so this has to come from somewhere. These are robust, well understood universals. There is a lot of dissent, but much of the dissent, some of the dissent says, okay, we see variation in language. It's a dissent about some technical detail, some technical aspect about a particular formulation of a universal, or about whether the universal is reflecting something that is domain specific to language as opposed to domain general. And those are harder questions to resolve.
Mm-hmm. And when it comes to morphology specifically, which is the main theme of our conversation today, how do you compare it across languages, which sometimes seem very different from one another?
Yep. So on the day-to-day level, it's kind of hard. But some of the stuff we've talked about today involves comparison. So there's various ways you can compare. You can think about this in terms of pinning down the form and comparing, or you can think about this in terms of pinning down the meaning and then comparing the different ways in which that meaning is expressed. So plurality, right? This you can compare across languages. We have a general universal sense of the number of objects. You have one object, you have more than one object, and then you can ask how do you express that in your language, and you can go and you can get a pretty good sense. People writing descriptive grammars, people go out and work with a community or from their own community. We hope there's more of that people from endangered languages and minority dialects will begin to describe their own languages and publish this. And when they do this, then we have these resources and we can go and we can look at that. And people use the same, often similar frameworks for describing a language, partly because a lot of the cognitive concepts are very similar. So like number, you'll find a chapter on number in any language that has a grammar of a language that has a number representation, or you could go out in the field and do the experiments yourself by putting like one or two objects in front of it. And then writing down the words or recording the words and listening to them and segmenting them. So some stuff can be done fairly easily cross-linguistically. The differences we see tend to be differences in form more than differences in the fundamental concepts. And so when you pin the concept down, you can then just begin to compare the forms cross-linguistically. Going the other way with form, there are interesting questions you can ask about prefixes and suffixes. So you can identify a content word, a verb or a noun, and then you can look at the pieces that are attached to it and say, are they attached on the left or on the right? I gave the example unlockable at the beginning of our discussion. That has a prefix and a suffix. There's a piece that comes in front and a piece that comes at the back. There's a lot of interesting facts about languages tend to be more suffixing than they are prefixing. All languages, regardless of their basic word order, not all languages. Overall, the vast majority of morphology is suffixing rather than prefixing, regardless of the word order of the language, whether verbs come before objects or objects come before verbs. And that's an interesting fact. But then you could say, I could do a form-based comparison. I could look at all of the prefixes in a variety of languages and ask, do I have universal patterns in the meanings they do and don't represent? Negation always prefixal, is negation always suffixal, etc. So you can, despite the surface variation, when you break it down into a more abstract symbolic representation and talk about the root word and the prefix and the suffix and the order of the suffixes, you can ask and then characterize these not in terms of, whether it's a z or a o or a a, but in terms of what it represents in terms of meaning or function. You can get a system that's much more directly comparable.
Mm-hmm. So I have one final question then, and again, regarding how we think about human universals in language, at least to a certain extent. So I want to ask you this because I've already actually posed more or less the same question to several other linguists, and I'm curious about your take on it. So let's say that universal grammar or some form of universal grammar is correct, and there are aspects of our cognition that is associated with language that we share as humans across all cultures, all societies. If that is correct, then should we expect it to be domain specific? That is, the cognition associated with language is specialized for the processing of language, or for it to be domain general and language being something that simply, if you want to take an evolutionary approach on this, of course, simply piggybacked on parts of our cognitive system that evolved for other purposes, primarily.
Let me react to the way you phrased this. One particular word you asked about, should we expect it to be one way or another? Mm. And I guess the question is, in light of what would we have expectations? Maybe this is my own personal history of this, but a priori, with no other assumptions, no other beliefs, and no other study about it, I would expect that everything is domain general. I would say, why would there be a domain specific part of ultimately the brain, somehow encoded in the brain, that makes us filter the world in a particular way? But the same thing I think would be true of vision. Why would babies fixate on a face, on two dots in a line? Once we discover that that's true, it is true, right? There is some domain-specific fixation module that tells you look for faces, right? And then you can sort of ask in evolutionary terms why that exists, and people give stories about it, and I think it has to do with, making sure you don't get left alone in the jungle and this kind of stuff. So you could ask then about language, right? We could recast this. A priori, just coming to the topic from the beginning, why would it be the case that there would be any domain-specific universals? But there appear to be domain-specific universals. So again, for the notion of person, there are culturally relevant distinctions that are never made monomorphemically, where there's just a single morpheme that makes that meaning. The inventory of meanings that we make in person, author of the speech act, addressee of the speech act, and other, right? And then the inclusive that combines the two, and that's it. Those are the only possibilities. That seems to be domain specific in the sense that culturally and consciously, we can certainly make and manipulate and use other distinctions. So it's not coming in any obvious way from culture that these are the categories that language is going to have, but these are the categories that language has. So then we can ask, we rephrase your question, rather than saying, what would I expect out of the blue to be the state of affairs? A more interesting question is, how representative is that example compared to all of the other examples? Look at the other examples and ask about them. How much are they telling us something domain specific or domain general? And that's hard and requires collaboration of people across. I'm going this evening to a panel on collaboration among psychologists, computationalists, and linguists, right? How do we get to this stuff? I can't know all of the pieces outside of language. How do we get to figure out these questions? Even there, when we say it's domain general, and this goes back to the question about the evolution of the thinking of the representation of universal grammar, it is fundamentally clear that languages, person systems are built on these categories, and that this is not specifically domain general, that it's these categories. But what is domain specific? Is it these categories with this interpretation that we are forced to do? Or is it something that says, given the way psychology works and theory of mind works, etc., there is a domain-specific categorization function that constrains the way linguistic categories are built out of the primitives that are fed to it from a domain external system? I have no idea, but I think it's a really, really fundamentally interesting question. But it's a slightly different question than the one about expectations. It's about, given the evidence that we have, what do we make of this evidence, and what is it telling us about ultimately how the cognitive system works?
Great. So, Dr. Bobaljik, just before we go, would you like to tell people where they can find you and your work on the internet?
Ah, cool. Okay, sure. So my last name, which I guess you'll see somewhere in a link or something, Bobaljik, silent J, .com is a link that points to my Harvard webpage, and you can find my work there. You'll find links to my work there. A lot of the work that you'll find there is more specific than these kinds of questions. I think there are other authors who actually write very engagingly about these kinds of questions that I would suggest. Can plug a couple of people. David Adger just wrote a book that came out last year. I don't know if you've interviewed him. I think it's called Language Unlimited. That's a more of a discussion for people who are interested not in the technical details of linguistics. It's a great discussion of some new higher level questions accessible. But sure, if people want my work, and I'm happy to hear feedback, my website, the Harvard website's good.
Great. So I'm leaving the link in the description box of the interview. And Dr. Bobaljik, thank you so much again for taking the time to come on the show. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. This has been a lot of fun.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Ergo Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windegar, Rui Inácio, Zup, Mark Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Mikkel Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Fortiago Nunes, Fergal Cossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Labyrinth, João Linhares, Stantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londoño Correia, Yannick Punter, Dana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Alman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Lowacki, Georgios Theophanos, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry Dealey Jr., Old Erringbone, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismail Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, B.R. Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Jos Necht. A special thanks to my producers, Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugni, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Giancarlo Montenegro, Alni Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.